Hello, friends. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The first body appeared at mile marker 247 on Interstate 35, just south of Austin, arranged with such meticulous precision that Texas State Trooper Marcus Rodriguez initially mistook it for a training mannequin left behind by some twisted practical joke. The victim lay perpendicular to the highway, arms spread in perfect symmetry, positioned exactly 10 ft from the white line that separated the shoulder from the travel lane. What made Rodriguez's blood run cold wasn't just the body's placement, but the realization that he had driven this exact stretch of highway less than 4 hours earlier during his routine patrol, and there had been nothing there. It was November 2019, and Rodriguez had been working the night shift along the A35 corridor for 6 years, long enough to know every curve, every overpass, every place where drivers typically broke down or accidents occurred. The stretch between Austin and San Antonio was his territory, 80 miles of America's most heavily traveled north-south interstate, carrying everything from long-haul truckers making their way between Mexico and Canada to college students heading home for Thanksgiving break, to families driving toward Disney World vacations that would create memories lasting a lifetime. At 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, traffic was light but steady, the perfect conditions for spotting anything unusual along the roadside. Rodriguez had developed an eye for details during his years of highway patrol. The way legitimate breakdowns looked, different from abandoned vehicles. How accident scenes created specific patterns of debris, the telltale signs that distinguished mechanical failure from human tragedy. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the carefully arranged horror he discovered at mile marker 247. The victim was identified as Rebecca Martinez, a 28-year-old nursing student from San Antonio who had been driving home from her sister's wedding in Dallas. Her car was found 15 mi north, pulled over at a rest stop with the engine still running, driver's door open, and her purse sitting on the passenger seat with all contents intact, including over $200 in cash and credit. Cards that would have been immediately valuable to any ordinary criminal. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled, but what puzzled investigators was the complete absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. Rebecca's fingernails were unbroken. Her knuckles showed no abrasions, and there were no traces of foreign DNA under her nails or on her clothing. It was as if she had submitted to her death without resistance, a finding that contradicted everything known about her personality. She didn't fight, Dr. Patricia Chen explained during the autopsy briefing at the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that came from years of examining violent death. There's no evidence she even tried to resist. It's as if she went willingly with whoever killed her, or was somehow incapacitated before she realized the danger she was in. Rebecca's friends and family described her as cautious and street smart, someone who carried pepper spray, always locked her car doors, and had taken self-defense classes at the community college where she studied nursing. The idea that she would have gone willingly with a stranger, particularly in the isolated conditions of a highway rest stop late at night, seemed impossible to everyone who knew her. Trooper Rodriguez coordinated with local law enforcement and federal investigators, but the case seemed to stall immediately. Security cameras at the rest stop showed Rebecca's car arriving at 11:23 p.m. But the angle didn't capture anyone approaching the vehicle or any other cars in the area during the relevant time period. No witnesses reported seeing anything suspicious, and the crime scene yielded no physical evidence beyond the body itself and the mysterious precision of its placement. The positioning of Rebecca's body had been so exact that investigators initially wondered if they were dealing with someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder or military training. The perpendicular alignment to the highway was mathematically precise. The arm positioning was symmetrical to the degree, and the distance from the white line had been measured with what appeared to be professional surveying equipment. 3 weeks later, the pattern repeated with horrifying precision. Maria Santos, a 34-year-old teacher from Houston, was found at mile marker 186, positioned identically to Rebecca Martinez, perpendicular to the highway, arms spread symmetrically, exactly 10 ft from the white line. Her car was discovered at a different rest stop, engine running, door open, personal belongings undisturbed, and no signs of struggle in the vehicle or surrounding area. Maria had been driving home from a conference in Dallas where she had been presenting research on childhood literacy programs. Her colleagues described her as professional and careful, someone who planned her routes in advance and maintained regular contact with family members during long trips. The fact that she had vanished without alerting anyone suggested that whatever had happened had occurred quickly and without warning. By the time the third victim appeared, Jennifer Walsh, a 31-year-old accountant from Dallas, found at mile marker 154. The Texas Rangers had assigned a task force to what the media had dubbed the interstate phantom killings. The precision of the body placement, the identical circumstances of the vehicle abandonment, and the complete lack of physical evidence suggested a sophisticated predator who understood both highway patrol procedures and the psychological vulnerabilities of women traveling alone. The media attention brought both helpful tips and dangerous copycats. Several women reported being followed by suspicious vehicles on Interstate 35, leading to increased patrol presence, but also false alarms that stretched law enforcement resources thin. Amateur investigators began driving the highway looking for clues, sometimes interfering with legitimate police work, and occasionally creating safety hazards with their aggressive surveillance of other drivers. Senior Texas Ranger Captain David Thompson took command of the investigation, bringing 30 years of experience with serial crimes and interstate cases. Thompson had worked the 35 corridor during his early career and understood both its opportunities and its dangers from a law enforcement perspective. What he discovered about the killer's methodology would challenge everything law enforcement thought they knew about highway predators. "This isn't random," Captain Thompson explained during a briefing with state troopers assigned to the E35 corridor. "The killer is selecting victims based on specific criteria, intercepting them at predictable locations, and displaying their bodies in ways designed to send a message. The mile markers aren't arbitrary. They're counting down towards something, and we need to figure out what that something is before he reaches his destination." Analysis of the crime scenes revealed disturbing patterns that had been missed during initial investigations. Each body had been positioned with astronomical precision, aligned with constellations visible at the time of discovery. The spacing between crime scenes followed mathematical progressions that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic killing. Most chilling was the realization that if the pattern continued, the killer was working toward mile marker 0, the point where I-35 crossed the Mexican border at Laredo. Thompson's team created detailed charts mapping the relationships between crime scene locations, victim characteristics, and timing. The pattern that emerged showed a killer who was not only methodical, but who was working according to a predetermined schedule that might allow law enforcement to anticipate his next move if they could decode his system. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a long-haul trucker named Carl Mitchell, who had been driving the E35 corridor for over 20 years and noticed something that state patrol procedures had missed. Mitchell had developed the observational skills that came from spending thousands of hours on the same roads, learning to recognize patterns and anomalies that might escape notice during shorter trips. At each rest stop where victims' cars had been found, there were tire tracks from a vehicle that had parked in the truck section rather than the passenger car area. Mitchell explained to investigators during a detailed interview at the DPS headquarters. "Someone's been using the trucker areas to watch the car section. You park a van or large SUV in the truck lot. You got a perfect view of who's stopping alone, who looks vulnerable, who's traveling without companions, and truckers mind their own business. We don't pay attention to other vehicles unless they're causing problems." Mitchell's observation opened a new avenue of investigation that had been overlooked because of assumptions about how predators operated in highway settings. Most law enforcement surveillance focused on passenger vehicle areas where potential victims would be found, but the killer had been using the truck parking sections as observation posts that provided excellent sight lines while remaining outside. the primary areas of police attention. The revelation shifted the investigation's focus to surveillance footage from truck stops and rest areas along the I-35 corridor. While passenger car areas were typically well monitored with multiple camera angles and good lighting, the truck parking sections often had limited camera coverage and large blind spots, providing concealment opportunities that a sophisticated predator could exploit while maintaining visual contact with potential victims. Enhanced analysis of security footage required weeks of painstaking review, but eventually revealed a dark blue panel van that had been present at multiple rest stops during the time frame when victims had disappeared. The van was always parked in locations that provided clear sight lines to passenger vehicle areas, while remaining in camera blind spots or areas where image quality was too poor to reveal clear details. License plate enhancement technology, originally developed for national security applications, was brought in to analyze the grainy footage. The process required multiple attempts and sophisticated computer algorithms, but eventually revealed partial numbers that led to a registered owner, Thomas Crenshaw, a 45-year-old former paramedic who had lost his medical certification 5 years earlier, following allegations of inappropriate behavior with female patients. Crenshaw's background painted a picture of a man whose legitimate medical training had been perverted into something monstrous. His paramedic experience had taught him anatomy, pharmacology, and most importantly, how to approach distressed individuals in ways that bypassed their natural caution. His knowledge of highway systems came from years of responding to interstate accidents, giving him intimate familiarity with patrol schedules, communication blind spots, and the logistics of moving along major highways without detection. The paramedic training had also taught Crenshaw how to quickly assess people's physical and psychological condition, skills he had apparently adapted for identifying vulnerable targets. His medical background would have made him appear trustworthy to potential victims, while his knowledge of emergency procedures would have allowed him to create convincing scenarios that might compel someone to leave their vehicle willingly. When Texas Rangers executed a search warrant at Crenshaw's registered address, a storage facility outside of Kyle, Texas, they discovered the full scope of his operation and the sophisticated planning that had gone into his crime spree. The storage unit had been converted into a mobile command center, equipped with police scanners capable of monitoring multiple law enforcement frequencies, detailed maps of the E35 corridor marked with patrol schedules and shift changes, and surveillance, equipment capable of monitoring multiple rest stops simultaneously. But the most disturbing discovery was Crenshaw's victim selection database. He had been systematically photographing lone female travelers at rest stops for over 2 years, building detailed profiles that included license plate numbers, physical descriptions, travel patterns, and behavioral observations. His notes revealed a predator who studied his targets for weeks before making contact, learning their routines, and identifying the optimal moments for approach. The database contained hundreds of photographs, far more than the 3 known victims, suggesting that Crenshaw had been conducting surveillance operations on a massive scale, while selecting only specific individuals who met his criteria for targeting. Many of the photographed women were likely unaware they had ever been under surveillance, having simply stopped for fuel or restrooms during routine trips. He wasn't just hunting randomly, explained FBI profiler Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been brought in to assist with the investigation. Crenshaw was operating like a researcher, treating the interstate system as his laboratory and lone female travelers as subjects for his experiments in psychological manipulation and control. Each victim was carefully selected based on specific characteristics that made them suitable for his purposes. The investigation revealed Crenshaw's methodology in chilling detail. He would identify potential victims during their first stops at rest areas, then track their progress along the interstate using real-time traffic monitoring systems available to anyone with internet access. Commercial trucking companies used these systems to monitor their fleets, but the same technology could be used to follow individual vehicles if someone had the license plate number and basic technical knowledge. When a target stopped at a rest area where he had positioned himself, Crenshaw would approach their vehicle wearing paramedic clothing and claiming to have received reports of a medical emergency involving their family member. He carried authentic law looking medical equipment and identification that would have appeared legitimate to anyone not trained to spot forgeries. He exploited the most basic human instinct, the desire to help family in crisis. Dr. Martinez explained during a task force briefing, by presenting himself as a medical professional with urgent information about a loved one's emergency, he could bypass all normal caution. Victims would follow him willingly, believing they were rushing to save someone's life. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and drew on Crenshaw's medical training and his years of experience dealing with people in crisis situations. He understood exactly which words and scenarios would create the sense of urgency needed to overcome normal safety precautions, and he had practiced his approach until it became automatic and convincing. Crenshaw's mobile command center also contained detailed notes on law enforcement patrol patterns, shift schedules, and response procedures. He had been monitoring police radio traffic to track trooper locations and avoid areas where his activities might be observed. The level of preparation indicated someone who understood that avoiding detection required as much planning as the crimes themselves. The search for Crenshaw intensified when investigators realized his victim selection database contained photographs and profiles of over 50 women, suggesting that Rebecca Martinez, Maria Santos, and Jennifer Walsh were just the beginning of a much larger planned killing spree. Geographic analysis of his surveillance patterns indicated he was preparing to expand his hunting ground to include other major Texas interstate corridors, potentially targeting the I-10 corridor between Houston and San Antonio, or the I-20 route, through East Texas. The timeline analysis showed that Crenshaw had been accelerating his activities with shorter intervals between victims and more sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection. The mathematical progression of his crime scene location suggested he was building towards some kind of culminating event, possibly at the Mexican border, where I-35 terminated. The manhunt ended dramatically when Trooper Rodriguez, who had discovered the first victim and remained obsessed with solving the case, spotted Crenshaw's van during a routine patrol near Buda, Texas. The van was parked in the truck section of a rest stop, where a lone female driver had stopped for fuel, matching exactly the pattern identified by investigators. I recognized the positioning immediately, Rodriguez later explained during his testimony at Crenshaw's trial. Same angle relative to the passenger car area, same distance from the main facilities, same blind spot relative to the security cameras. I knew I was looking at our killer in the act of selecting his next victim, and I had maybe minutes to prevent another murder. Rodriguez called for backup while maintaining surveillance, watching as Crenshaw approached a young woman filling her gas tank wearing scrubs and carrying what appeared to be medical equipment. Crenshaw began speaking urgently to the woman, gesturing toward his van as if explaining the need for immediate transport to a medical emergency involving her family. The arrest was made without incident, but the woman Crenshaw had been approaching, a 26-year-old graduate student named Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to the trooper, was found to be in the early stages of chemical sedation. Analysis later revealed that Crenshaw had injected her with a fast-acting paralytic agent during what she thought was a medical examination to determine if she was fit to travel to her supposed family emergency. I believed him completely. Lisa testified during the trial. He knew details about my family that made his story seem credible, and he had medical equipment and credentials that looked authentic. I was already getting in his van when the trooper arrested him. Another few minutes, and I would have been his next victim. The injection techniques Shaw had been using explained why his previous victims had shown no signs of struggle. The paralytic agent would have prevented resistance while leaving victims conscious and aware of what was happening to them. A particularly cruel aspect of his methodology that added psychological torture to physical violence. During interrogation, Crenshaw revealed the disturbing psychological framework that had motivated his crimes. His dismissal from emergency medical services had occurred after female patients complained about inappropriate touching and questioning during medical procedures. But Crenshaw maintained that he had been trying to help them understand their vulnerability as women traveling alone in dangerous situations. They had no idea how dangerous it was. he told investigators with the clinical detachment that characterized his entire confession. Women driving alone on the interstate, stopping at random locations, trusting anyone who approaches them with a story about helping their family. I was teaching them about reality, about how easily their trust could be exploited by someone with bad intentions. The body positioning along the interstate, Crenshaw explained, was intended as a warning system for other women travelers. The astronomical alignments were meant to suggest divine judgment, while the countdown toward the Mexican border represented what he called the ultimate lesson, a mass casualty event he had been planning at the Laredo truck stop that would have demonstrated the vulnerability of the entire interstate system to predatory exploitation. Each body was a mile marker on the road to understanding, Crenshaw said, during one of several recorded interviews that would later be used in law enforcement training programs. By the time I reached Laredo, enough women would have seen the pattern, understood the message, and stopped traveling alone. I was saving lives by taking a few to serve as examples. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed a man whose legitimate medical training had been corrupted by misogynistic ideology and grandiose delusions about his role as protector and teacher. His paramedic background had provided both the skills to commit his crimes and the rationalization that allowed him to view murder as a form of public health intervention. Dr. Amanda Torres, the forensic psychologist who conducted the evaluation, found that Crenshaw genuinely believed his actions were altruistic, a delusion that made him particularly dangerous because it allowed him to escalate his violence while maintaining a self-image as someone who was helping society. This type of criminal psychology was especially difficult to detect and counter because the perpetrator's behavior was internally consistent with their distorted worldview. The trial became a landmark case in Texas legal history as prosecutors had to prove that Crenshaw's interstate activities constituted a single criminal conspiracy rather than separate state crimes. The federal charges ultimately included kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy to commit terrorism based on his stated intention to create mass panic along the interstate corridor and his plans for a culminating attack at the border. The defense attempted to argue that Crenshaw's medical background and claims of altruistic motivation should be considered as mitigating factors, but the evidence of systematic planning and the cruelty of his methods undermined any claims of diminished responsibility. The paralytic drugs, the elaborate surveillance operation, and the psychological torture inflicted on victims demonstrated clear criminal intent rather than delusional behavior. For Trooper Rodriguez, who testified extensively during the trial, the case fundamentally changed his approach to highway patrol and his understanding of the vulnerabilities that existed along America's interstate system. We think of the highways as safe because they're public, well-traveled, and monitored, he explained to fellow troopers during training sessions developed after Crenshaw's arrest. But that same accessibility makes them hunting grounds for predators who understand how to exploit our assumptions about safety. The conviction resulted in multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, but the psychological impact on the interstate community proved lasting and pervasive. Rest stops along the I-35 corridor implemented enhanced security measures, including improved lighting that eliminated dark areas where predators could hide, additional cameras covering truck parking areas, and emergency communication systems that allowed travelers to summon help without leaving their vehicles. The Texas Department of Public Safety developed new protocols for investigating abandoned vehicles and suspicious activity at rest stops, recognizing that the interstate system's design created opportunities for sophisticated predators while making detection and prevention more challenging than in traditional law enforcement environments. Training programs now included modules on recognizing predatory surveillance and understanding how legitimate services could be impersonated for criminal purposes. For the families of Crensshaw's victims, the knowledge that their loved ones had died, believing they were rushing to help family members added an extra dimension of tragedy to their grief. The funerals became community events that emphasized both the victims' compassionate nature and the need for increased vigilance when traveling alone. He turned their best qualities against them, said Rebecca Martinez's sister during Crenshaw's sentencing hearing. My sister died because she was the kind of person who would drop everything to help family in need. He murdered her for being exactly the kind of person we should all strive to be. And that makes his crimes even more evil. The Interstate Phantom case became required study material for law enforcement agencies across the country, illustrating how modern highway systems could be weaponized by predators with sufficient patience and planning. The case highlighted the need for better coordination between state and federal agencies when investigating crimes that crossed multiple jurisdictions and involved sophisticated surveillance techniques. Federal funding was allocated for enhanced security infrastructure at rest stops and truck stops along major interstate corridors, including improved lighting, expanded camera coverage, and emergency communication systems. The improvements were marketed as general safety enhancements rather than responses to criminal activity to avoid creating public panic while still addressing the vulnerabilities that Crenshaw had exploited. Today, mile markers 247, 186, and 154 on Interstate 35 are marked with small memorial plaques honoring Crenshaw's victims, while serving as reminders of the price of assuming that public spaces are inherently safe. The plaques include QR codes that link to safety information for solo travelers, turning the sites of tragedy into tools for prevention and education. The memorial information emphasizes practical safety measures, maintaining communication with family members during travel, being suspicious of strangers who approach with urgent requests for help, and understanding that legitimate emergency responders follow specific protocols that can be verified. The goal is to maintain appropriate caution without creating paranoia that would discourage necessary travel. Trooper Rodriguez continued patrolling the HA-35 corridor until his retirement in 2024, but he never again drove past those mile markers, without remembering the bodies positioned with astronomical precision and the realization that evil could hide behind the most trusted professions. His final report on the case included recommendations that have influenced highway safety protocols nationwide. The Interstate Phantom taught us that predators can adapt to any environment, Rodriguez wrote in his retirement. Crenshaw used the highway system's strengths, its accessibility, its predictability, its service infrastructure as weapons against the people it was designed to serve. Our response has to be equally sophisticated and adaptive. The Interstate Phantom is gone, but his legacy remains in the enhanced awareness of law enforcement and travelers alike. That America's highway system, for all its convenience and connectivity, remains a frontier where predators can operate if they understand the systems well enough to exploit them. The open road that represents freedom to most Americans had become, in Thomas Crenshaw's hands, a carefully planned trap for those whose only crime was trusting that help offered in crisis was genuine. The case continues to influence highway safety research and law enforcement training, serving as a reminder that criminal innovation requires constant vigilance and adaptation from those charged with public safety. The interstate system that connects American communities also creates opportunities for those who would exploit the trust and predictability that make modern travel possible. Texas State Trooper Jennifer Walsh had driven every mile of Highway 83 through the Rio Grande Valley so many times that she could navigate the route in complete darkness, recognizing every curve, every landmark, every place where the road surface changed texture beneath her patrol car's tires. But on the fog-shrouded night of January 15, 2022, the familiar road felt alien and threatening in ways that made her grip the steering wheel until her knuckles went white and her forearms ached from the tension. The call had come in at 11:47 p.m. from a frantic tourist whose GPS had led him in circles for 3 hours while searching for his hotel in McAllen. Reports of vehicles driving the wrong way on the northbound lanes, causing near collisions with legitimate traffic before vanishing without explanation into the thick fog that had rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico like a living entity, transforming the familiar landscape into something from a nightmare. Highway 83 served as the primary artery connecting the border towns of the Rio Grande Valley to the rest of Texas, carrying everything from produce trucks loaded with citrus from local orchards to Border Patrol vehicles pursuing smugglers through the dense brush country that characterized this remote region. Summary: the two-lane highway stretched for over 100 miles through some of the most isolated territory in the state, where cell phone coverage was spotty at best, and the nearest help could be an hour away even in perfect weather conditions. During normal conditions, the highway carried a predictable mix of traffic. Local residents commuting between small towns, long-haul truckers taking scenic routes to avoid interstate congestion, border patrol agents conducting their endless cat-and-mouse games with smugglers, and occasional tourists heading to the beaches of South Padre Island or the bird-watching areas around the Rio Grande. But fog transformed the highway into something entirely different. A maze of limited visibility where familiar landmarks disappeared, and even experienced drivers could become disoriented. The fog that night was unlike anything Trooper Walsh had experienced in her 7 years of patrolling the valley. It rolled in from the coast in thick, suffocating waves that reduced visibility to less than 50 ft and seemed to muffle all sound except for the steady drip of condensation from roadside vegetation. The Weather Service had issued advisories warning drivers to avoid unnecessary travel, but Highway 83 remained open because it was the only route connecting several small communities to essential services like hospitals and emergency facilities. Walsh had been responding to the wrong-way driver reports for over an hour, racing to locations where panicked motorists claimed to have barely avoided head-on collisions, only to find empty highway stretching into the fog with no sign of the vehicles that had supposedly caused the panic. Each time she arrived at a reported incident location, she found skid marks and other evidence that vehicles had indeed swerved to avoid collisions, but no trace of the wrong-way drivers who had supposedly caused the dangerous situations. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Legitimate drivers would call 911 to report wrong-way vehicles that had forced them to take evasive action. But by the time law enforcement arrived at the scene, there was no evidence of any wrong-way traffic, except for the physical traces left by the legitimate drivers who had been forced to swerve or brake hard. The wrong-way vehicles seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only confusion and potential accidents. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. Walsh radioed during her fourth response call of the night. I'm at mile marker 23 investigating reported wrong-way driver. No vehicles visible at this time, but I've got fresh tire tracks and what looks like debris from near-miss incidents. These callers aren't making this up. Something's definitely happening out here, but I can't figure out what it is. The debris Walsh was finding included pieces of plastic from broken headlight covers, fragments of paint from vehicle contact, and skid marks that showed the characteristic patterns of emergency braking and evasive maneuvering. The physical evidence confirmed that dangerous encounters were occurring, but the absence of any wrong-way vehicles or their drivers created a mystery that standard traffic enforcement procedures couldn't address. The breakthrough came when Walsh decided to position herself at a strategic overlook that provided visibility over several miles of highway despite the fog. The Falcon Dam overlook, normally used by tourists photographing the Rio Grande, sat elevated above the highway and offered sight lines that extended further than ground-level observation. From her elevated position, she could see the ghostly headlights of legitimate traffic moving north and south through the dense mist, creating ethereal patterns in the fog that seemed almost supernatural. What she observed over the next 30 minutes would challenge her understanding of criminal behavior and reveal a sophisticated operation that had been exploiting the valley's unique geography and weather patterns for months. The fog, which most people saw as a dangerous inconvenience, was being used as cover for criminal activities that took advantage of reduced visibility and the confusion it created among drivers unfamiliar with the area. At 12:23 a.m., Walsh observed a set of headlights moving south in the northbound lanes, exactly as the panicked callers had described. But instead of a confused or intoxicated driver who had accidentally entered the highway going the wrong direction, she was watching a deliberate and calculated maneuver. The wrong-way vehicle would approach legitimate northbound traffic until the other driver was forced to swerve or brake hard, then would immediately disappear into one of the many ranch roads that intersected the highway. Using night vision equipment that had been issued to patrol officers for wildlife observation and accident investigation, Walsh tracked the wrong-way vehicle to a ranch road entrance, where it met with two other vehicles that had been waiting in the darkness. Within minutes, All three vehicles disappeared into the dense brush country that stretched for miles on either side of the highway, leaving no trace except the confused and shaken legitimate drivers who continued north, unaware that they had been deliberately targeted. The maneuver was executed with military precision, suggesting coordination between multiple drivers and advanced planning of escape routes. The timing was perfect. The wrong-way vehicle would appear just long enough to force evasive action from legitimate traffic, then vanish before law enforcement could respond. The fog provided ideal conditions for the operation, offering concealment while creating the confusion needed to mask the deliberate nature of the encounters. This isn't random, Walsh realized as she documented the pattern in her incident report. Someone's using wrong-way driving as a technique to force specific vehicles off the road or into vulnerable positions. But why? What's the endgame? Are they trying to cause accidents? Or is this part of some larger criminal operation? The answer came when Walsh expanded her surveillance to include the ranch roads where the wrong-way vehicles had been disappearing. Using aerial support from Border Patrol helicopters equipped with thermal imaging systems designed for tracking smugglers, she discovered a network of temporary camps hidden in the dense brush. Camps that were being used to process something far more valuable and sophisticated than the drugs or illegal immigrants that typically moved through the region. The camps were filled with luxury cars, high-end pickup trucks, and motorcycles that had been reported stolen from cities across Texas and beyond. But this wasn't a typical car theft ring operating with crude methods and quick turnarounds. The vehicles were being systematically stripped for specific high V-value components that could be sold internationally without raising suspicions about their origin using techniques that suggested professional automotive expertise. The wrong-way driving technique was being used to identify vehicles worth stealing by forcing them to stop or slow down in locations where the occupants could be observed and the vehicles evaluated for their theft potential. Cars that met specific criteria. New models with expensive options, low mileage or particular, makes that were in high demand in international markets were followed to their destinations and later stolen using sophisticated electronic tools that could bypass modern security systems. The operation represented a sophisticated evolution of traditional car theft, combining psychological manipulation, technical expertise, and geographic advantages to create a system that was far more efficient and profitable than conventional criminal methods. The fog wasn't just providing cover. It was an essential element of the operation that made the wrong-way driving technique feasible while masking the subsequent surveillance and theft activities. Captain Maria Santos of the Texas Highway Patrol organized a task force that included Border Patrol agents experienced in tracking smuggling operations, customs officials familiar with international vehicle trafficking, and federal investigators specializing in organized crime networks that operated across state and national borders. What they discovered was an operation that had been exploiting the Rio Grande Valley's unique characteristics for over 2 years. The Rio Grande Valley's proximity to Mexico made it an ideal location for processing stolen vehicles before shipping them across the border. While its isolated geography provided concealment for temporary processing facilities, the region's frequent fog conditions created regular opportunities for the wrong-way driving technique. While the sparse law enforcement coverage meant that suspicious activities could continue for extended periods without detection. The operation was led by Carlos Mendoza, a 52-year-old former automotive engineer who had lost his job during industry downsizing and had used his technical expertise to develop methods for quickly identifying, stealing, and processing high V-value vehicles. His background in automotive electronics had taught him how to defeat modern security systems, while his engineering training had shown him how to efficiently disassemble vehicles for parts that could be smuggled across the border, in shipments small enough to avoid customs attention. Mendoza's transformation from legitimate automotive professional to criminal mastermind illustrated how economic disruption could push skilled individuals toward illegal activities when their expertise became valuable to criminal organizations. His engineering background had made him particularly effective at organizing the complex logistics required for international vehicle trafficking. While his understanding of automotive technology allowed him to stay ahead of law enforcement detection methods, Mendoza wasn't just stealing cars, explained Agent Rodriguez from the Border Patrol's anti-muggling unit during a briefing with the task force. He was operating like a manufacturing facility, using the wrong-way driving technique to conduct market research on potential inventory, then processing stolen vehicles through hidden camps that function like automated disassembly plants optimized for speed and profit. The camps discovered in the brush contained sophisticated equipment for vehicle disassembly that rivaled legitimate automotive recycling facilities. Hydraulic lifts allowed workers to access vehicle undersides quickly. Plasma cutters could separate metal components without damaging valuable parts, and specialized tools could remove electronic components without triggering security systems that might alert law enforcement to theft activities. The operation could process a luxury SUV in under 4 hours, separating it into components that could be smuggled across the border in small shipments that wouldn't attract customs attention. Engines went to rebuilders in Mexico. Electronic systems were sold to repair shops throughout Central America, and body panels were shipped to collision repair facilities as far away as South America, creating a distribution network that made detection and recovery nearly impossible. But the most disturbing aspect of Mendoza's operation wasn't the vehicle theft itself, but the escalating risks his wrong-way driving technique posed to innocent travelers who had the misfortune to encounter his scouts during their surveillance activities. Analysis of highway patrol incident reports revealed that the fake wrong-way drivers had caused over 30 accidents during the 6 months they had been operating, including several serious injuries and 1 fatality. The accidents weren't intentional. They were collateral damage from an operation that prioritized profit over public safety. Mendoza's crews were instructed to avoid causing actual collisions, but the wrong-way driving technique was inherently dangerous, particularly in fog conditions where reaction times were reduced and visibility was severely limited. The death toll was acceptable to Mendoza as long as it didn't interfere with the profitability of his operation. He was willing to kill innocent people to steal their cars. Trooper Walsh testified during Mendoza's trial, her voice carrying the controlled anger that came from months of investigating preventable accidents. Every time one of his people drove the wrong way down Highway 83, they were creating potentially fatal situations for families just trying to get home safely. The fog made it even more dangerous. Legitimate drivers had almost no reaction time when headlights appeared in their lane. The investigation revealed that Mendoza had specifically chosen Highway 83 because its isolation and weather patterns provided cover for his operation, while its role as a major transportation corridor ensured a steady stream of potential targets. The Rio Grande Valley's proximity to Mexico allowed for quick disposal of stolen goods, while the region's sparse law enforcement coverage made detection less likely than in more heavily patrolled areas. The wrong-way driving incidents had been carefully planned to avoid patterns that might alert law enforcement to their criminal nature. Different crews operated on different nights. Vehicles were rotated to prevent recognition, and timing was varied to avoid establishing routines that might be detected by patrol officers. The sophistication of the operation suggested organizational skills that went far beyond typical criminal enterprises. Raids on the brush camps yielded evidence of over 200 vehicles that had been processed through Mendoza's operation during its 2-year existence, with components shipped to buyers in Mexico, Central America, and even as far away as Eastern Europe. The international scope of the trafficking network required coordination with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries to track down buyers and attempt recovery of stolen property. The wrong-way driving incidents stopped immediately after Mendoza's arrest, providing confirmation that the dangerous encounters had been deliberately orchestrated rather than representing genuine navigation errors or impaired driving. But the psychological impact on Highway 83 travelers proved lasting, with many drivers reporting anxiety about nighttime travel on the highway, particularly during foggy conditions when visibility was limited and the memory of phantom headlights appearing in their lane remained vivid and terrifying. Local businesses that depended on highway traffic, gas stations that served late-night travelers, restaurants that catered to truckers and shift workers, motel that housed temporary workers in the agricultural industry, suffered significant losses as people chose alternate routes or simply avoided traveling during conditions that might conceal wrong-way drivers. The economic impact extended beyond immediate business losses to affect the entire regional economy that depended on Highway 83 as a transportation lifeline. The trauma wasn't limited to economic effects. Several drivers who had been forced to take evasive action by Mendoza's scouts required counseling to deal with the psychological aftermath of their near-death experiences. The knowledge that their terror had been deliberately orchestrated for criminal profit added an element of violation that went beyond the fear of random accidents, creating lasting anxiety about highway travel that affected their daily lives. Sheriff Martinez worked with state officials to increase patrol frequency along Highway 83 and install additional emergency call boxes at strategic locations. But the road's reputation as a hunting ground for wrong-way drivers proved difficult to overcome. Despite evidence that the criminal operation had been dismantled, local civic organizations launched campaigns to rebuild confidence in highway safety. But the association with deliberate automotive terrorism had become permanently embedded in public consciousness. The case prompted a comprehensive review of highway maintenance worker screening procedures across Texas, as investigators discovered that Mendoza had recruited several current and former highway department employees who provided inside information about patrol schedules and road conditions. New protocols required background checks every 2 years, mandatory psychological evaluations for employees with access to sensitive information, and GPS tracking of all official vehicles to ensure accountability for their locations and activities. State legislators used the Mendoza case to support legislation requiring more extensive background investigations for any workers who had access to information that could be used to plan criminal activities. The Highway Safety Act established new standards for monitoring employees, whose jobs provided opportunities for criminal collaboration, while maintaining the operational flexibility needed for legitimate highway maintenance and law enforcement. The international aspect of Mendoza's operation required coordination with Mexican law enforcement agencies and international customs organizations to track down the distribution network that had been purchasing stolen vehicle components. The investigation revealed connections to similar operations in Arizona and California, suggesting that wrong-way driving techniques might be spreading to other regions with favorable geographic and weather conditions. Mendoza was ultimately convicted of multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, vehicle theft, reckless endangerment, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. His conviction carried a 25-year sentence that reflected both the scope of his criminal enterprise and the danger his methods had posed to public safety. The sentence also included restitution orders that would never be fully satisfied given the international distribution of stolen property. Federal agencies used the Mendoza case to develop new protocols for investigating unusual traffic patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity rather than simple driver error or impairment. Training programs now include modules on recognizing systematic wrong-way driving and understanding how legitimate traffic enforcement can be exploited by criminals who understand law enforcement procedures and limitations. The conviction also triggered investigations in other states where similar wrong-way driving incidents had been reported, leading to the discovery of related operations that used comparable techniques for different criminal purposes. The wrong-way driving method proved to be surprisingly versatile, adaptable to various criminal enterprises that needed to identify and target specific vehicles or create controlled chaos for camouflage. The camps hidden in the Rio Grande Valley brush were dismantled and the areas restored, but law enforcement agencies maintained increased surveillance of the region, recognizing that its geographic advantages would continue to attract criminal organizations seeking to exploit the border's proximity and the highway system's vulnerabilities. The combination of isolation, weather conditions, and transportation infrastructure that had made the region attractive to Mendoza would likely appeal to future criminal enterprises as well. Today, Highway 83 carries normal traffic through the Rio Grande Valley, but the memory of the phantom wrong-way drivers serves as a reminder that even the most familiar routes can become hunting grounds for criminals with sufficient creativity and resources. The fog still rolls in from the Gulf of Mexico during winter months, but enhanced lighting and communication systems help ensure that legitimate travelers can navigate safely, while law enforcement agencies maintain the vigilance needed to detect and prevent criminal exploitation of weather and geography. Enhanced lighting systems installed after the Mendoza case use technology that penetrates fog more effectively than traditional highway lighting. While emergency communication systems allow drivers to report suspicious activities without leaving their vehicles, the improvements were marketed as general safety enhancements rather than crime prevention measures to avoid creating public panic, while addressing the specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited. The case files on the Highway 83 vehicle trafficking network remain active as investigators continue to track down recovered vehicle components and pursue international connections that may still be operating in other regions. The investigation revealed the existence of a sophisticated network of buyers, transporters, and processors that extended far beyond Mendoza's immediate operation, suggesting that dismantling the entire system would require years of continued international cooperation. For Trooper Walsh and her colleagues, the Midnight Mile taught valuable lessons about the need to look beyond obvious explanations and recognize that criminal organizations could adapt any situation to serve their purposes. The fog that seemed like a natural hazard had been weaponized by criminals who understood how to exploit environmental conditions for criminal advantage. The wrong way drivers taught us that we can't assume anything about traffic violations. Walsh explained during a training conference for Valley law enforcement. What looks like drunk driving or confused navigation might actually be sophisticated criminal activity designed to exploit our assumptions and our desire to help motorists in distress. We have to maintain professional skepticism while still providing the assistance that legitimate travelers need. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of rural highways to criminal exploitation, particularly in border regions where international trafficking networks could quickly move stolen goods out of the country before law enforcement could respond effectively. Federal agencies developed new strategies for monitoring unusual traffic patterns and investigating incidents that might indicate organized criminal activity disguised as routine traffic violations. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond immediate participants to influence how law enforcement approached the investigation of traffic incidents throughout Texas. The recognition that wrong-way driving could be a criminal technique, rather than an accident or impairment, led to enhanced training programs and new investigative protocols that might prevent similar operations from developing in other regions. The memorial erected for the motorist who died in one of the crashes caused by Mendoza's wrong-way drivers stands at mile marker 23. Serving as both a tribute to an innocent victim and a warning about the price of assuming that dangerous driving is always accidental rather than criminal. The inscription reads simply, "Drive alert, trust cautiously, report suspicious activity." A reminder that highway safety depends not just on following traffic laws, but on recognizing when those laws are being deliberately violated for criminal purposes. The wrong-way driving technique developed by Mendoza's organization has been studied by criminal justice researchers as an example of how traditional criminal methods can be adapted to exploit modern transportation systems. The case has become a standard example in courses on organized crime and international trafficking, illustrating how geographic advantages and technological capabilities can be combined to create criminal enterprises that operate across traditional jurisdictional boundaries. For residents of the Rio Grande Valley, the case served as a reminder that their region's unique characteristics, its border location, its weather patterns, its transportation infrastructure, made it attractive not just to legitimate businesses and residents, but also to criminal organizations seeking to exploit those same advantages for illegal purposes. The awareness has led to increased community vigilance and cooperation with law enforcement efforts to prevent similar operations. The fog continues to roll in from the Gulf of Mexico during winter months, creating the same conditions that Mendoza exploited for his criminal enterprise. But enhanced awareness among law enforcement and travelers, combined with improved infrastructure and communication systems, helps ensure that those conditions are less likely to be successfully exploited by future criminal organizations. The Midnight Mile of Highway 83 represents both the vulnerability and the resilience of rural transportation systems. While criminals like Mendoza can adapt environmental conditions and geographic features to serve their purposes, law enforcement and communities can also adapt their responses to prevent and detect such exploitation. The ongoing challenge is maintaining vigilance without allowing reasonable precautions to become paralyzing paranoia that would undermine the mobility and connectivity that highways are designed to provide. The last radio transmission from Texas State Trooper Daniel McKenzie came through dispatch at 2:14 a.m. on a moonless October night in 2021. His voice crackling with the static that plagued communications in the remote desert regions where cellular towers were sparse and radio signals had to travel vast distances across empty terrain. Unit 23 to dispatch. I've got a late model sedan about 3 mi east of mile marker 47. Looks like it's been here a while. No signs of the driver. I'm going to take a look around and see if anyone needs assistance. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from McKenzie, beginning a case that would baffle investigators and forever change how the Texas Department of Public Safety approached patrol operations in remote border regions. Highway 137 runs through some of the most isolated territory in the continental United States. A 2-lane ribbon of asphalt that connects the tiny community of Sanderson to the border crossing at Presidio, passing through over 120 miles of Chihuahuan desert, where distances between any signs of civilization can be measured in hours rather than miles. It's the kind of country where a breakdown can mean death, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees and winter nights can drop below 0 degrees C freezing, where the nearest help might be 2 counties away, and arrival could take hours, even in the best conditions. The landscape along Highway 137 is simultaneously beautiful and hostile. Vast expanses of desert stretching to distant mountains dotted with creosote bushes, ocotillo, and the occasional stubborn prickly pear cactus that has managed to find enough water to survive in soil that receives less than 10 in of rain per year. It's country that tests both machines and humans, where the sun can kill during the day and the cold can be equally deadly at night, where rattlesnakes and mountain lions pose real threats to anyone venturing away from the safety of their vehicle. Trooper McKenzie had been working this route for 8 years, long enough to know every ranch gate, every desert wash, every place where smugglers typically cross the border with drugs or illegal immigrants seeking passage to the interior of the United States. At 31 years old, he was considered one of the most experienced desert patrol officers in the region. Someone who understood the dangers of the empty country and took precautions that had kept him safe through thousands of miles of solitary patrol in conditions that would challenge the most experienced outdoorsmen. McKenzie's patrol routine included regular checks on the handful of ranchers who lived along the highway, welfare visits to ensure that elderly residents were coping with the isolation and harsh conditions, and constant vigilance for the drug trafficking activities that made the border region profitable but dangerous for criminal organizations. He carried extra water, emergency supplies, and satellite communication equipment as backup for the radio systems that sometimes failed in the vastness of the desert terrain. When McKenzie failed to respond to routine radio checks over the next hour, dispatch began trying to raise him on all available frequencies, including the emergency channels reserved for officer in distress situations. His GPS unit showed his patrol car stationary at mile marker 89, the same location where he'd reported stopping to investigate the abandoned vehicle. But attempts to establish communication yielded only static and silence. But when backup finally arrived, 2 Border Patrol agents who happened to be in the area conducting their own investigations of suspected smuggling activities, they found only McKenzie's empty cruiser, engine still running, driver's door open, and no sign of either the trooper or the abandoned vehicle he'd been investigating. The GPS coordinates were accurate, but the scene made no sense given McKenzie's final radio transmission. The search for Trooper McKenzie became the largest law enforcement operation in Terrell County's history, involving Texas Rangers, Border Patrol agents, sheriff's deputies from 3 counties, volunteer search teams from across West Texas, and specialized units trained in desert survival and recovery operations. Search helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras combed the desert for any sign of the missing officer, while ground teams followed every trail, every wash, every possible route Mackenzie might have taken on foot. The search operation faced unique challenges posed by the desert environment. Temperatures during the day reached over 100 degrees, making ground searches dangerous for the searchers themselves, while nighttime temperatures dropped into the 40s, creating conditions that would be deadly for anyone stranded without proper clothing and shelter. The terrain was rough and treacherous, with hidden arroyos and loose rock that could cause serious injuries to searchers moving through unfamiliar country and darkness. But Daniel Mackenzie had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only his patrol car and a growing sense among investigators that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple case of an officer who had gotten lost or injured in the desert. The absence of the abandoned vehicle that had prompted his stop added an additional layer of mystery that suggested deliberate criminal activity rather than accidental misfortune. Captain Sarah Rodriguez of the Texas Rangers took command of the YA. Investigation after the initial search failed to locate any trace of Mackenzie or provide any clues about what had happened during those crucial minutes after his last radio transmission. Her first step was to analyze the patrol car and its contents for any forensic evidence that might explain how an experienced officer could simply disappear from a known location. The forensic examination revealed disturbing details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Mackenzie's service weapon was still in its holster, suggesting he hadn't perceived any immediate threat when he left his vehicle. His radio was functioning normally, ruling out equipment failure as an explanation for his silence after the initial transmission. Most puzzling was the complete absence of any evidence that Mackenzie had left his vehicle voluntarily. No footprints leading away from the car, no signs of a struggle, no indication that he had been investigating anything specific. "It's like he just evaporated," Captain Rodriguez told the assembled search teams during one of many briefings held at the improvised command post in Sanderson. Everything about the scene suggests he was planning to return to his vehicle within minutes, but he never did, and we can't find any trace of where he went or what happened to him. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Rodriguez began reviewing similar cases from other remote patrol areas across the Southwest, looking for patterns that might explain Mackenzie's disappearance. What she discovered was deeply troubling. Over the past 5 years, 7 law enforcement officers had disappeared under similar circumstances while conducting routine patrols in isolated border regions of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. In each case, the pattern was remarkably consistent. Experienced officers working alone in remote areas. Last radio transmissions indicating they were investigating something that seemed routine. Patrol cars found empty with engines running and no signs of struggle. The cases had been investigated separately by different agencies and attributed to various causes. Officers getting lost, suffering medical emergencies, or becoming victims of cartel violence. But when viewed together, they suggested something more systematic and deliberately orchestrated. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental. All 7 officers had been experienced patrol officers with excellent survival skills and knowledge of their territories. All had disappeared during night shifts when backup was furthest away and response times were longest. All had made final radio transmissions indicating they were investigating something routine that shouldn't have posed any danger, and all had vanished without leaving any trace of what had happened to them. Federal investigators were brought in to coordinate what was now being treated as a potential serial crime targeting law enforcement officers across multiple states. Special Agent David Chen from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of someone who was specifically hunting isolated patrol officers, using their commitment to investigating suspicious activity and helping citizens in distress as a weapon against them. These officers were selected because of their dedication to their jobs. Agent Chen explained during a briefing with Southwest law enforcement agencies. The perpetrator is using fake scenarios, abandoned vehicles, distress calls, suspicious activity to lure experienced officers away from their vehicles and into situations where they become vulnerable to attack. This isn't random predation. It's systematic hunting of law enforcement personnel. The breakthrough came when investigators analyzed the GPS data from all 7 missing officers' patrol cars and discovered that the disappearances had occurred in locations that were invisible to Satellite surveillance due to natural geographic features, deep arroyos, narrow canyons, or areas where rock formations blocked overhead observation. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of surveillance technology was choosing locations where crimes could be committed without being detected from above. The geographic analysis revealed another disturbing pattern. All of the disappearance locations were within a day's drive of each other, suggesting that the perpetrator was mobile and familiar with the patrol territories of multiple law enforcement agencies. The locations also shared common characteristics that would appeal to someone seeking to ambush law enforcement officers. Limited visibility from the road, multiple escape routes, and terrain that would muffle sounds and prevent witnesses from observing criminal activity. The investigation focused on individuals with both law enforcement experience and detailed knowledge of Border Patrol routes and procedures. The suspect would need to understand police protocols well enough to create scenarios that would compel officers to investigate while also possessing the skills to overpower experienced law enforcement personnel who were trained to recognize and respond to threats. The profile led investigators to Marcus Thompson, a 48-year-old former Border Patrol agent who had been dismissed from federal service 3 years earlier, following allegations of excessive force and racist behavior toward migrants attempting to cross the border illegally. Thompson's personnel file revealed a pattern of complaints about his treatment of both immigrants and fellow officers, culminating in an incident where he had been accused of abandoning his partner during a dangerous pursuit operation in terrain similar to where the officers had disappeared. Thompson's dismissal had been acrimonious and contentious, with the former agent claiming that he was being persecuted for doing his job properly, while his supervisors were more concerned with political correctness than effective border security. He had filed multiple unsuccessful appeals and had threatened legal action against the Border Patrol for what he claimed was wrongful termination based on his willingness to use necessary force against criminal border crossers. When federal agents executed a search warrant at Thompson's isolated ranch house near Van Horn, they discovered evidence of a sophisticated operation targeting law enforcement officers across the southwest region. Maps marked with patrol routes, detailed schedules of officer assignments, and surveillance equipment capable of monitoring police radio frequencies revealed someone who had been planning attacks on law enforcement for months with military-level precision and preparation. But the most chilling discovery was Thompson's trophy room, a basement area where he had displayed items taken from his victims, including badges, weapons, and personal effects from all 7 missing officers. The room also contained detailed journals describing his methods for luring officers into ambush situations and his plans for what he called teaching lessons to law enforcement personnel who he believed had betrayed their oath to protect America's borders from foreign invasion. "They think they're heroes," Thompson had written in one journal entry that would later be used as evidence in his prosecution. "But they're part of the system that's destroying this country, letting criminals and terrorists pour across the border while they follow politically correct rules instead of doing what needs to be done to protect American citizens. I'm showing them what real border enforcement looks like. What happens when you betray your duty to protect America?" The search of Thompson's property led to the discovery of a series of hidden burial sites where the remains of 6 of the missing officers were found. The officers had been killed execution style after being forced to participate in what Thompson called border security training exercises, scenarios where they were required to make decisions about whether to pursue or detain suspects with incorrect choices resulting in death. The training exercises revealed Thompson's twisted psychology and his belief that he was qualified to judge whether fellow law enforcement officers were sufficiently committed to border security. He had forced his victims to participate in role-playing, scenarios based on actual Border Patrol situations, then executed those who failed to demonstrate what he considered appropriate levels of aggression towards simulated border crossers. Trooper Mackenzie's body was found in a carefully constructed underground bunker on Thompson's property. But unlike the other victims, Mackenzie was still alive when federal agents breached the facility. Thompson had been keeping him prisoner for over 2 weeks, using him as a test subject for what he called enhanced interrogation techniques, designed to determine whether the trooper was a true patriot or a system collaborator who had been corrupted by liberal policies. The rescue of Trooper Mackenzie was complicated by the discovery that Thompson had rigged his property with explosive devices designed to kill law enforcement officers who might attempt to raid his compound. The booby traps included pressure-sensitive mines, tripwire-activated charges, and remotely detonated explosives that could be triggered from multiple locations on the property. Bomb disposal experts required 6 hours to clear safe paths to the bunker where Mackenzie was being held, during which time Thompson barricaded himself in his house and began making rambling radio broadcasts about the need for real Americans to take back control of the border from politicians who had surrendered American sovereignty to foreign criminals and terrorists. The broadcasts, transmitted on emergency frequencies, revealed the depth of Thompson's paranoid delusions and his belief that law enforcement agencies had been infiltrated by traitors who were deliberately allowing the invasion of America by hostile foreign forces. His rants combined legitimate concerns about border security with conspiracy theories and racist ideology that portrayed immigration as a deliberate plot to destroy American civilization. The standoff ended when Thompson, apparently realizing that his capture was inevitable, detonated explosives that destroyed his house and killed him instantly. The explosion was powerful enough to be felt several miles away and created a crater where his house had stood, eliminating any possibility of gathering additional evidence about his methods or identifying potential co-conspirators. Mackenzie was rescued alive, but severely traumatized by his 2 weeks of captivity, during which Thompson had subjected him to constant interrogation about his loyalty to what the former agent called true American values. The interrogation had included sleep deprivation, stress positions, and psychological torture designed to break down Mackenzie's resistance and force him to admit that he was part of a conspiracy to undermine American border security. He wanted me to admit that I was part of a conspiracy to weaken border security. Mackenzie testified during the subsequent investigation into Thompson's activities. He kept saying that he was going to prove that law enforcement officers couldn't be trusted to protect America from invasion and that citizens would have to take matters into their own hands to save the country from traitors in uniform. The lie. Psychological evaluation of Thompson's journals and recorded statements revealed a man whose dismissal from the Border Patrol had triggered a paranoid break with reality, leading him to view all law enforcement officers as traitors to their country, unless they demonstrated unwavering commitment to his extremist interpretation of border security duties. His military background had provided the tactical skills needed to ambush experienced officers, while his former position with the Border Patrol had given him detailed knowledge of patrol procedures and vulnerabilities. Thompson's case became a study in how legitimate concerns about border security could be twisted into violent extremism when combined with personal grievances and mental instability. His journals revealed a progression from professional disappointment to conspiracy thinking to violent action that illustrated the dangers of radicalization within law enforcement communities. The case prompted a comprehensive review of security, procedures for law enforcement officers working alone in remote areas. New protocols required officers to maintain more frequent radio contact with dispatch, use GPS tracking systems that couldn't be easily disabled, and work in pairs when investigating. Suspicious activity in isolated locations where backup would be delayed. For Trooper Mackenzie, who returned to duty after extensive psychological counseling and medical treatment, the experience fundamentally changed his approach to patrol work and his understanding of the threats faced by law enforcement officers in remote areas. He became an advocate for improved officer safety procedures and testified before state legislators about the need for better support for officers working in isolated regions where they were particularly vulnerable to attack. Thompson exploited our training against us, Mackenzie explained during a law enforcement conference where he spoke about his experience as Thompson's prisoner. We're taught to investigate suspicious activity, to help people in distress, to respond when citizens need assistance. He used those instincts to set traps, knowing that good officers would walk into dangerous situations because that's what we're supposed to do to serve the public. The memorial service for the 6 officers killed by Thompson drew law enforcement personnel from across the Southwest, serving as both a tribute to the victims and a reminder of the risks faced by those who patrol America's remote regions. The service emphasized that the officers had died doing their jobs properly, investigating situations that seemed to require law enforcement attention, and that their dedication to duty had been exploited by someone who had perverted his own law enforcement training into a weapon against his former colleagues. The investigation into Thompson's activities revealed that his killing spree had been planned for over 2 years, during which time he had conducted extensive surveillance of patrol officers across multiple states. His ranch had served as a base of operations for monitoring police radio frequencies, tracking patrol schedules, and identifying officers who regularly worked alone in remote areas where they would be most vulnerable to attack. Thompson's journals contained detailed psychological profiles of his intended victims, showing that he had studied their personalities, their commitment to duty, and their likely responses to various scenarios designed to lure them into vulnerable positions. He had specifically targeted officers known for their dedication and willingness to go beyond the call of duty, understanding that their best qualities as law enforcement officers could be turned against them by someone who understood their professional obligations and personal psychology. He was hunting the best officers, explained Agent Chen during the final briefing on the case. Thompson knew that mediocre or lazy officers might ignore suspicious activity or wait for backup, but dedicated officers would investigate immediately. He used their professionalism and courage as weapons against them, exploiting their commitment to public service to put them in positions where they could be captured and killed. The case also revealed troubling gaps in communication between different law enforcement agencies operating in border regions. Thompson had been able to monitor multiple radio frequencies and track the movements of officers from various departments, but those departments had not been sharing information about unusual incidents or missing personnel in ways that might have revealed the pattern earlier and prevented additional victims. Federal agencies implemented new information sharing protocols requiring immediate notification when officers disappeared or encountered unusual circumstances during routine patrols. The protocols also established procedures for coordinating searches across jurisdictional boundaries and sharing intelligence about potential threats to law enforcement personnel operating in remote areas. For the families of Thompson's victims, the knowledge that their loved ones had been targeted specifically because of their dedication to duty provided both comfort and additional grief. The officers had died not because they made mistakes or failed to follow procedures, but because they had done exactly what they were trained to do when citizens appeared to need help or when suspicious activities required investigation. "My husband died because he was a good cop," said Linda Mackenzie, the wife of another officer killed by Thompson, no relation to survivor Daniel Mackenzie. Thompson knew that Steve would never ignore someone who seemed to be in trouble, that he would always investigate when something looked wrong. He used my husband's decency and professionalism against him, turning his best qualities into the cause of his death. The psychological profile developed from Thompson's case became a standard training tool for law enforcement agencies across the country, illustrating how dismissed or disgruntled former officers could pose unique threats to their former colleagues. The case highlighted the importance of monitoring former personnel who had been terminated under contentious circumstances and maintaining awareness of potential insider threats who might use their knowledge of law enforcement procedures for criminal purposes. Thompson's military and law enforcement background had given him tactical advantages that made him particularly dangerous to other officers. His knowledge of police procedures, radio protocols, and patrol routes had allowed him to set traps that exploited standard law enforcement responses to suspicious activity, while his training in combat and survival techniques had given him the skills needed to overpower and capture experienced officers. The remote locations where Thompson had operated also posed challenges for investigation and prevention that were unique to border regions. The vast empty country of West Texas provided numerous opportunities for ambushes while making detection and response difficult even under the best circumstances. The case led to increased aerial surveillance of border regions and enhanced GPS tracking for officers working in isolated areas. Today, Highway 137 continues to carry occasional traffic through the empty desert, but the memory of Trooper Mackenzie's disappearance has changed how law enforcement approaches patrol operations in remote areas. Officers working alone are required to maintain more frequent contact with dispatch, and suspicious vehicles or activities are investigated by teams rather than individuals whenever possible. The ranch where Thompson conducted his killing spree was seized by federal authorities and eventually demolished, but the site remains marked on law enforcement maps as a reminder of the case and its implications for officer safety. Training exercises are periodically conducted in the area to help officers recognize potential ambush sites and develop tactics for avoiding similar traps. Trooper Daniel McKenzie eventually returned to full duty, but requested transfer to a more populated patrol area where backup was readily available, and response times were measured in minutes rather than hours. His experience as Thompson's prisoner provided valuable insights into the psychology of anti-law enforcement extremists and the methods they might use to target officers who work alone in remote areas. Thompson thought he was teaching us lessons about border security and American values. McKenzie reflected during a training session for new troopers, but the only lesson he taught was that hatred and paranoia can turn anyone into a monster. Even someone who once took an oath to protect and serve. We have to be prepared for threats that come from within our own community, not just from outside it. The case files on Marcus Thompson fill several cabinets at the Texas Ranger headquarters in Austin, serving as a comprehensive study of how insider knowledge can be weaponized against law enforcement. The files include not only evidence from his crimes, but also analysis of his psychological deterioration and recommendations for preventing similar cases in the future. For law enforcement officers working in remote areas of the Southwest, the Vanishing Patrol case serves as a constant reminder that the isolation that makes their job challenging also makes them vulnerable to predators who understand their procedures and their commitment to duty. The empty desert that defines much of the region remains beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But officers now approach that danger with enhanced awareness of threats that may come from unexpected sources. The memorial erected at mile marker 89 on Highway 137, where Trooper McKenzie's patrol car was found empty, includes the names of all 7 officers targeted by Thompson, along with a reminder that law enforcement officers face dangers not just from criminals they pursue, but sometimes from those who were once their colleagues. The inscription reads, "They answered the call to serve and protect, never suspecting that their dedication would be used against them." The Vanishing Patrol of West Texas ended with rescue rather than tragedy for one officer, but the case's impact on law enforcement culture and procedures continues to influence how agencies approach officer safety in remote areas. The lesson, learned at such a terrible cost, that dedication and professionalism can be exploited by those who understand them, remains a sobering reminder of the complex threats faced by those who patrol America's most isolated frontiers. The radar gun read, 73 MP in a 65 MP zone. A routine traffic stop that Texas State Trooper Michael Santos had made thousands of times during his 12 years patrolling the pine forests and small towns of East Texas, where humidity hung in the air like a physical presence, and the scent of pine needles mixed with the aroma of barbecue smoke from roadside restaurants that served as community gathering places for locals and waypoints for travelers passing through the region. But as he activated his emergency lights and pulled over the silver Honda Accord on State Highway 259 near Carthage, Santos had no idea he was about to encounter a predator who had turned traffic enforcement into a hunting ground, using the authority and trust associated with law enforcement uniforms to commit crimes that would terrorize East Texas for months before the pattern was finally recognized and the sophisticated nature of the operation understood. It was a humid Thursday afternoon in August 2020, the kind of sweltering day when heat mirages danced off the asphalt, and even experienced troopers looked forward to the brief respite provided by air-on-conditioned patrol cars. Highway 259 was a busy corridor connecting the oil and gas fields of East Texas to major cities, carrying a steady stream of commercial traffic. Workers commuting between small towns separated by miles of dense forest and tourists heading to the recreation areas around Catawba Lake, where cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created landscapes that seemed more like Louisiana than Texas. The traffic stop began normally, following the routine that Santos had perfected through years of experience and training. Santos approached the Honda's driver's side window, noting that the lone occupant was a woman in her 30s, who seemed nervous, but not unusually so for someone who had just been pulled over for speeding on an unfamiliar highway. Her nervousness appeared to be the typical anxiety of someone who was running late and had been caught breaking traffic laws, rather than the extreme fear or hostility that might indicate more serious problems. Rebecca Martinez was traveling from Tyler to visit her sister in Marshall, a routine trip she made every few weeks to help care for their elderly mother who was recovering from hip replacement surgery. The drive typically took about 90 minutes through countryside that she found peaceful and relaxing. A welcome break from her job as a nurse at a busy hospital emergency room where stress and crisis were constant companions. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Santos said in the professional but friendly tone that characterized his interactions with the public. "I stopped you for traveling 73 in a 65 zone. May I see your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance?" Rebecca fumbled in her purse for the documents, apologizing for the delay and explaining that she had been running late for an important appointment with her mother's physical therapist. Her explanation was plausible and her demeanor cooperative. Exactly the kind of interaction that Santos handled routinely, without any expectation of complications or unusual circumstances. Santos returned to his patrol car to run the license, check and process the citation, a routine procedure that should have taken only a few minutes. But when he keyed his radio to contact dispatch with Rebecca's information, he received only static in response. The clear communication he normally maintained with headquarters had been replaced by white noise that made radio contact impossible. Santos tried different radio frequencies, including the emergency channels that should have been available regardless of normal communication problems, but none yielded clear communication with dispatch or other units. His mobile data terminal was also malfunctioning, showing error messages instead of the database access he needed to verify Rebecca's license and registration and determine whether there were any warrants or other issues that might complicate the routine traffic stop. After several minutes of troubleshooting both radio and computer systems, Santos decided to return to Rebecca's car and explain the situation. Technical difficulties were not uncommon in remote areas of East Texas, where dense forests could interfere. With radio signals and cellular coverage was sometimes spotty, despite the presence of modern communication infrastructure. But when Santos approached the Honda, he found the driver's door open and Rebecca Martinez gone. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, license and registration still in her hand from when she had been gathering them for the traffic stop. The engine was still running, the air conditioning blowing cold air into the empty car, and her cell phone lay on the driver's seat as if it had been dropped suddenly during some kind of emergency or urgent departure. Santos immediately began searching the area around the traffic stop, calling Rebecca's name and looking for any sign of where she might have gone. The highway was bordered by dense pine forest on both sides with thick underbrush that could easily conceal someone who had wandered into the woods, perhaps seeking privacy for a restroom break or attempting to retrieve something that had blown out of her car during the stop. But after 20 minutes of searching and repeatedly calling her name while exploring the forest on both sides of the highway, Santos found no trace of Rebecca Martinez. The forest was thick enough to provide concealment, but not so dense that someone couldn't be heard if they were within reasonable distance of the road. The silence was complete and unsettling, particularly given that Rebecca had no apparent reason to leave her vehicle or avoid contact with law enforcement. Santos was finally able to reach dispatch on his radio. The communication problems had mysteriously cleared up as suddenly as they had appeared, and requested backup to assist with what was now being treated as a missing person case that had developed during what should have been a routine traffic enforcement action. The investigation that followed would reveal that Santos had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of what would become known as the speed trap killer case. A series of disappearances that exploited the routine nature of traffic stops to target victims who believed they were dealing with legitimate law enforcement but were actually encountering a sophisticated criminal operation that used fake traffic stops as a cover for kidnapping and murder. Over the next 3 months, 5 more women disappeared under identical circumstances across East Texas. Each had been pulled over for minor traffic violations on rural highways. Each had been alone in their vehicles, and each had vanished during what appeared to be routine traffic stops. In every case, the responding trooper reported radio and computer malfunctions that prevented them from completing normal procedures. And in every case, the victims disappeared while the trooper was attempting to resolve the technical problems. The pattern was so subtle that it took months for investigators to recognize that the disappearances were connected. Each incident was initially investigated as a separate missing person case, with various theories about what might have happened. Victims wandering into the woods and getting lost, suffering medical emergencies that cause confusion or becoming disoriented, and leaving the scene on foot for reasons that couldn't be determined from the available evidence. The similarities between cases were noticed first by Detective Lisa Rodriguez of the Longview Police Department, who had been tracking missing persons cases throughout East Texas as part of a regional database project designed to identify patterns that might be missed when investigations were conducted in isolation. When she plotted the disappearances on a map and compared the circumstances, the pattern became unmistakable and deeply disturbing. But when Captain Lisa Rodriguez of the Texas Highway Patrol, no relation to the detective, analyzed the cases together, she recognized a sophisticated operation that was targeting female drivers through fake traffic stops conducted by someone wearing law enforcement uniforms and driving vehicles that closely resembled official patrol cars. The technical malfunctions experienced by legitimate troopers were not coincidental equipment failures, but deliberate sabotage designed to create opportunities for criminal activity. We're dealing with someone who understands police procedures well enough to conduct convincing traffic stops, Captain Rodriguez explained during a briefing with East Texas law enforcement agencies. He's using electronic jamming equipment to disrupt real troopers' communications, creating windows of opportunity to abduct victims, while the legitimate officers are dealing with equipment malfunctions that prevent them from completing their duties or summoning assistance. The investigation revealed that all 6 disappearances had occurred in locations where cell phone coverage was naturally limited due to terrain or distance from transmission towers, suggesting that the perpetrator was choosing traffic stop locations that would isolate victims from potential help while providing cover for his activities. The dense forests of East Texas provided natural concealment, while the region's scattered population meant that crimes could be committed without witnesses, who might alert authorities or interfere with criminal activities. Enhanced analysis of the crime scenes yielded trace evidence that legitimate state troopers' vehicles had been present at each location, but also tire tracks and other physical evidence suggesting that additional vehicles had been at each location during the relevant time periods. Someone was monitoring real police traffic, intercepting legitimate stops, and using the confusion created by communication jamming to commit abductions while maintaining the appearance of routine law enforcement activity. The breakthrough came when Trooper Santos, who had been haunted by Rebecca Martinez's disappearance and had spent countless off-duty hours researching the technical malfunctions that had prevented him from completing the traffic stop, decided to conduct his own investigation into the electronic interference that had disrupted his equipment. Working with electronic specialists from the Department of Public Safety, he discovered that his radio and computer failures had been caused by powerful jamming signals broadcast from nearby locations. Someone with sophisticated electronic warfare, equipment was targeting our communications, Santos explained during a task force meeting that brought together investigators from multiple agencies. They would wait for legitimate traffic stops to begin, then jam our radios and computers to create confusion and delay. While we were trying to figure out what was wrong with our equipment, they were abducting our traffic stop subjects using methods that we still don't fully understand. The investigation focused on individuals with both law enforcement experience and access to electronic jamming equipment that would be capable of disrupting police communications without being detected by standard counter-surveillance measures. The perpetrator would need detailed knowledge of police procedures to conduct convincing fake traffic stops, while also possessing technical skills to disrupt law enforcement communications in ways that would appear to be routine equipment malfunctions, rather than deliberate sabotage. Federal investigators brought in specialists from the FBI's Cybercrime Division, who used direction-finding equipment to trace the source of the jamming signals that had been disrupting police communications during the disappearances. The investigation required sophisticated technical analysis and months of patient work to identify the electronic signatures that distinguished deliberate jamming from natural interference or equipment failure. The investigation led to Robert Chen, a 54-year-old former military communications specialist who had been dishonorably discharged from the Army 10 years earlier, following allegations of inappropriate behavior toward female personnel under his command. Chen's background revealed a man whose legitimate military training in electronic warfare had been combined with a growing obsession with law enforcement procedures and authority symbols that had developed during his civilian career in private security. After his discharge, Chen had worked as a security guard and private investigator, positions that had given him access to police equipment and procedures, while feeding his fantasies about exercising power over others. His work in private security had allowed him to acquire law enforcement equipment and uniforms through legitimate channels, while his military background had provided the technical knowledge needed to disrupt police communications. When federal agents executed a search warrant at Chen's property near Henderson, they discovered a sophisticated operation that had been targeting female drivers across East Texas for over a year. Chen had converted a large outbuilding into a replica police station complete with holding cells, interrogation equipment, and a collection of law enforcement uniforms and badges from various agencies that would have appeared authentic to anyone not trained to detect forgeries. The most disturbing discovery was Chen's training facility, where he had been holding his victims while conducting what he called citizen compliance exercises. The 6 missing women were found alive, but severely traumatized in underground cells that Chen had constructed beneath his property. Designed to be soundproof and escape-proof, they had been subjected to months of psychological conditioning designed to make them completely obedient to anyone wearing a law enforcement uniform. The underground facility revealed the true scope of Chen's operation and the sophisticated planning that had gone into his crimes. The cells were equipped with monitoring equipment that allowed him to observe his victims constantly, while the soundproofing ensured that their presence would never be detected by neighbors or visitors to his property. The facility included a workshop where he had been perfecting the electronic jamming equipment used to disrupt police communications during his fake traffic stops. He was using them as test subjects for his theories about citizen compliance, explained FBI profiler Dr. Amanda Walsh, who interviewed the survivors as part of the investigation into Chen's methods and motivations. Chen believed that American citizens had become too resistant to authority, and he was trying to develop methods for ensuring complete obedience to law enforcement. His victims were essentially laboratory subjects in his experiments with psychological conditioning and behavioral modification. Chen's journals revealed a disturbing worldview that combined anti-government paranoia with fantasies about creating a society where citizens would show absolute deference to authority figures. He viewed his fake traffic stops as recruitment operations for subjects who could be trained to demonstrate proper respect for law enforcement, while his electronic jamming equipment allowed him to operate without interference from legitimate authorities who might not understand the importance of his work. The electronic jamming equipment found on Chen's property was military-grade gear that he had acquired through surplus sales and modified for use against civilian communication systems. His ability to disrupt police radios and computers had allowed him to create chaos during legitimate traffic stops while positioning himself to intercept victims who believed they were dealing with official law enforcement, conducting routine traffic enforcement activities. The modification of military equipment for criminal purposes required sophisticated technical knowledge that Chen had acquired during his military service and enhanced through years of study and experimentation. His electronic warfare background had taught him not only how to disrupt communications, but also how to do so in ways that would appear to be routine equipment failures rather than deliberate interference. During interrogation, Chen showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, expressing pride in what he called his citizen education program, he maintained that his victims had been improved by their experience and were now better citizens who understood the importance of respecting authority and following instructions from law enforcement officers without question or resistance. They learned to follow instructions properly, Chen told investigators with the clinical detachment that characterized his entire worldview. Before their training, they would have questioned orders, demanded explanations, asserted rights that interfere with law enforcement efficiency. Now they understand that compliance is the highest form of citizenship and that resistance to authority leads only to unnecessary conflict and punishment. The rescue of Chen's victims required extensive psychological counseling and deprogramming to help them recover from months of systematic conditioning that had been designed to break down their resistance to authority and replace it with automatic obedience. Several of the women required long-term psychiatric care to deal with the trauma of their captivity and the realization that their trust in law enforcement uniforms had been exploited so thoroughly and systematically. The psychological conditioning that Chen had employed was sophisticated and drew on legitimate research into behavioral modification and compliance psychology. His military background had exposed him to psychological operations techniques, while his work in private security had given him access to law enforcement training materials that he had adapted for his criminal purposes. The case prompted a comprehensive review of security procedures for traffic stops in rural areas, with new protocols requiring troopers to verify their communications were functioning properly before conducting stops in isolated locations. Electronics detection equipment was deployed to identify unauthorized radio jamming, and procedures were established for coordinating with federal agencies when sophisticated electronic interference was suspected. For Trooper Santos, who had initiated the investigation that led to Chen's capture, the case fundamentally changed his approach to traffic enforcement and his understanding of how routine police procedures could be exploited by sophisticated criminals. He became an advocate for enhanced officer safety training and testified before state legislators about the need for better protection against electronic warfare tactics used by criminals. Chen turned our most basic procedures against us, Santos explained during a law enforcement conference attended by officers from across the region. He understood that troopers conducting traffic stops would be focused on the driver they had stopped, not watching for additional threats or monitoring their equipment for signs of interference. He used our communication equipment as a weapon, creating confusion that allowed him to operate undetected for months. The conviction of Robert Chen on multiple federal charges, including kidnapping, impersonating law enforcement officers, and conspiracy, resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His sophisticated operation had required years of planning and preparation, representing a level of criminal organization that challenged traditional assumptions about highway predators and the threats they posed to both law enforcement and civilians. His facility was dismantled and the property seized, but the case led to enhanced training for law enforcement officers on recognizing and responding to electronic warfare tactics. The techniques Chen had developed were studied by federal agencies and incorporated into training programs designed to help officers detect and counter similar threats in the future. The victims of Chen's compliance training eventually recovered enough to testify during his trial, providing crucial evidence about his methods and motivations while demonstrating remarkable courage in confronting their captor in court. Their testimony revealed the extent to which he had used psychological manipulation and systematic conditioning to achieve his goals of creating perfectly obedient citizens. He tried to turn us into robots, testified Rebecca Martinez during the sentencing phase of Chen's trial. He wanted us to stop thinking, stop questioning, stop being human beings with rights and dignity. He used the uniform and badge that we were taught to respect and trust, and he turned them into tools for breaking our spirits and destroying our ability to resist authority. Today, East Texas highways carry normal traffic, but the memory of the speed trap killer has changed how both law enforcement and citizens approach traffic stops in rural areas. New protocols require verification of officer identity and communication functionality, while citizens are educated about their rights and the proper procedures for legitimate traffic enforcement that can help them distinguish between real and fake police interactions. The case became a standard training example for law enforcement agencies nationwide, illustrating how sophisticated criminals could exploit the trust and authority associated with police uniforms while using advanced technology to disrupt law enforcement communications. The investigation techniques developed during the Chen case have been applied to similar incidents in other states, leading to the discovery of related operations that might otherwise have gone undetected. For the families of Chen's victims, the knowledge that their loved ones had been targeted specifically because they were law-abiding citizens who respected authority added an extra dimension of violation to their trauma. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between citizens and law enforcement, forcing communities to balance trust with vigilance in ways that continue to influence police-community relations. The memorial, erected near the site of Rebecca Martinez's abduction, includes information about recognizing legitimate law enforcement stops and procedures for reporting suspicious activities that might indicate fake police operations. It serves as both a tribute to Chen's victims and a reminder that the symbols of authority that protect communities can also be exploited by those who understand their power and are willing to abuse the trust they represent. The Speed Trap Killer case remains a cautionary tale about the sophisticated methods modern criminals can use to exploit law enforcement procedures and public trust. For the troopers who patrol East Texas highways and the citizens who travel them, the case serves as a permanent reminder that vigilance and verification are essential components of public safety in an era when technology can be used to deceive as easily as it can be used to protect. The electronic jamming techniques that Chen developed have been studied by federal agencies and incorporated into defensive measures designed to protect law enforcement communications from similar attacks. The case led to enhanced encryption and backup communication systems that make it more difficult for criminals to disrupt police operations. While training programs help officers recognize the signs of electronic interference, the psychological impact of the case extended beyond the immediate victims to affect the entire East Texas law enforcement community, which had to grapple with the realization that their procedures and equipment could be turned against them by someone with sufficient technical knowledge and criminal intent. The case became a watershed moment that changed how officers approached their daily duties and interactions with the public. The dense pine forests of East Texas continue to provide the natural beauty that attracts tourists and residents, but they also serve as a reminder of how isolation can be exploited by criminals who understand how to use environmental factors to their advantage. The case highlighted the ongoing tension between maintaining public access to rural areas and ensuring the safety of both law enforcement officers and citizens who travel through remote regions. For Chen's victims, the recovery process was long and difficult, requiring not only medical treatment for the physical effects of their captivity, but also extensive psychological therapy to address the conditioning they had endured. Support groups were established to help them rebuild their trust in legitimate authority while learning to recognize and resist manipulation tactics that might be used by other criminals. The case also prompted changes in how private security, companies and military surplus dealers screen customers and monitor the sale of equipment that could be used for criminal purposes. Enhanced background checks and reporting requirements were implemented to make it more difficult for individuals with criminal intent to acquire the tools needed for sophisticated operations, like Chen's fake police enterprise. Today, the site where Chen operated his fake police station has been cleared and converted to other uses. But the memory of what occurred there continues to influence law enforcement training and public safety awareness throughout East Texas. The case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand the systems they seek to exploit and have the patience and resources to carry out long-term operations that challenge traditional assumptions about crime and punishment. Texas State Trooper Catherine Morris had always prided herself on her ability to spot impaired drivers from miles away. The telltale swerving, the inconsistent speed patterns, the delayed reactions that marked someone who shouldn't be behind the wheel of a two-ton vehicle capable of causing devastating accidents. But on the windswept evening of September 3, 2022, as she pursued what appeared to be a severely intoxicated driver, weaving across both lanes of Interstate 40 through the Texas Panhandle, Morris had no idea she was about to encounter a predator who used hypnosis and psychological manipulation to turn the state's busiest east-west highway into his personal hunting ground. The call had come in at 7:23 p.m. from multiple motorists reporting an erratic driver in a blue pickup truck who was creating dangerous conditions for other travelers on the interstate between Amarillo and the Oklahoma border. The truck was swerving unpredictably, varying its speed from 35 mph to over 80 mph without apparent reason, and forcing other drivers to take evasive action to avoid collisions that could have resulted in multiple fatalities. Interstate 40 carried over 50,000 vehicles per day through the Texas Panhandle, serving as a major transcontinental route that connected California to the East Coast through some of the flattest, most desolate country in America. The highway passed through endless expanses of wheat fields and cattle ranches, where distances between towns could be measured in hours, and where a breakdown or accident could leave travelers stranded in conditions that ranged from scorching heat in summer to blizzard conditions in winter. The landscape along I-40 through the Panhandle was hypnotic in its monotony. Endless straight stretches of highway disappearing into the horizon, broken only by the occasional oil derrick, grain elevator, or abandoned farmhouse that served as landmarks for drivers making the long journey across the continent. The repetitive nature of the terrain was notorious for causing driver fatigue and the phenomenon known as highway hypnosis, where drivers could travel for miles without conscious awareness of their actions. Trooper Morris located the blue pickup near Conway, weaving between lanes with no apparent pattern or purpose, while other drivers honked their horns and flashed their lights in attempts to get the erratic driver's attention. She activated her emergency lights and attempted to initiate a traffic stop, but the driver failed to respond to her signals, continuing to drive erratically while maintaining speeds that made a safe stop difficult and dangerous for everyone involved. "Dispatch, this is Unit 15. Morris radioed as she followed the weaving truck, maintaining a safe distance while trying to anticipate the driver's unpredictable movements. "I'm in pursuit of a blue pickup. Texas plates. Driver appears to be severely impaired. Vehicle is failing to yield and creating hazardous conditions for other traffic. I'm going to attempt a controlled stop at the next available location." What followed was unlike any traffic stop Morris had experienced in her 9 years as a state trooper patrolling the highways of the Texas Panhandle. The pickup finally pulled over at a rest area near Groom, but instead of the confused or belligerent drunk driver she expected to encounter, Morris found herself face to face with Dr. Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who claimed to be a retired psychology professor conducting research on highway hypnosis and driver fatigue. "Officer, I'm so sorry about my driving," Dr. Webb said as Morris approached his window, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to lecturing students and colleagues. "I've been conducting a study on the effects of monotonous highway conditions on driver attention, and I'm afraid I became so absorbed in my observations that I wasn't paying adequate attention to my own driving behavior." Webb's explanation seemed plausible given the location and conditions. Interstate 40 through the Panhandle was notorious for causing driver fatigue due to its endless straight stretches and hypnotic repetition of identical landscapes that could lull drivers into trance-like states. Highway hypnosis was a well-documented phenomenon that affected thousands of drivers annually, leading to accidents caused by momentary lapses in attention or awareness. But something about the man's demeanor triggered Morris's instincts, though she couldn't immediately identify what was wrong with the situation. Webb appeared sober and articulate, showed no obvious signs of impairment, and his explanation for his erratic driving was reasonable, given the research context he described. Yet Morris felt an inexplicable unease that made her more cautious than usual during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Webb produced a valid driver's license and registration, along with what appeared to be official research documentation from the University of Texas Psychology Department. The papers included detailed research protocols, institutional review board approvals, and academic credentials that would have been difficult to forge convincingly. He was polite, cooperative, and showed no signs of alcohol or drug impairment when Morris administered field sobriety tests. "I realized my driving was dangerous," Webb continued, his voice taking on what Morris later described as an oddly soothing quality that seemed to ease the tension she normally felt during traffic stops. "I've been studying how the repetitive nature of highway travel can induce altered states of consciousness, and I'm afraid I experienced exactly the phenomenon I was researching. It's fascinating how the mind can be affected by consistent visual patterns and rhythmic motion. As Webb spoke, Morris found herself becoming strangely relaxed, despite the dangerous circumstances that had brought them together. His voice had a hypnotic quality that seemed to ease the tension she normally felt during traffic stops, and she caught herself losing focus on proper procedure as she listened to his explanations about highway hypnosis research and the psychological effects of long-distance driving. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, much longer than would be typical for a routine traffic stop. As Webb described his research in detail and shared fascinating insights about the psychological vulnerabilities created by highway travel, Morris found herself genuinely interested in his work and less concerned about the traffic violations that had prompted the stop in the first place. It wasn't until later that Morris realized she had been under the influence of sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques during what should have been a routine impaired driving investigation. Webb had used her traffic stop as an opportunity to test his hypnotic methods on a law enforcement officer, treating her as an unwitting subject in his experiments with highway-induced altered states and the potential for psychological control of individuals in positions of authority. The investigation that followed Webb's arrest, he was ultimately cited for reckless driving and released pending further investigation, would reveal that the supposed psychology professor had been using Interstate 40 as a laboratory for testing hypnotic techniques on travelers, particularly targeting women driving alone on the isolated stretches of highway that characterize the Texas Panhandle. Webb's research involved deliberately driving erratically to force other vehicles to pull over, then approaching their drivers while claiming to be conducting official studies on highway safety and driver psychology. His academic credentials and professional demeanor allowed him to gain the trust of victims who believed they were participating in legitimate research when in fact they were being subjected to psychological manipulation designed to make them vulnerable to further exploitation. Captain David Rodriguez of the Texas Highway Patrol organized a task force to investigate Webb's activities after Morris reported her strange experience during the traffic stop and her growing suspicion that she had been manipulated during what should have been a routine enforcement action. The investigation revealed that Webb had been operating along Interstate 40 for over 18 months, targeting lone female drivers with his fake research studies while using sophisticated psychological techniques to compromise their ability to resist his suggestions. Dr. Webb was using the highway itself as a weapon, Captain Rodriguez explained during a briefing with federal investigators who had been brought in to assess the scope of Webb's activities. He understood that long-distance driving already puts people in a suggestible state, and he was exploiting that natural vulnerability to conduct unauthorized psychological experiments on unwitting subjects who had no idea they were being victimized. The task force discovered that Webb had been renting different vehicles to avoid detection while conducting his highway experiments, using his legitimate academic credentials to establish credibility with victims and law enforcement officers who might encounter him during his research activities. His method involved driving erratically until concerned motorists or law enforcement pulled over to check on his welfare, then engaging them in conversations about highway hypnosis while using subtle psychological techniques to increase their suggestibility. Webb's true background revealed a man whose legitimate academic credentials had been used to mask increasingly unethical experiments on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. He had indeed been a psychology professor at UT Austin, specializing in hypnosis and behavioral modification, but had been forced to resign 5 years earlier following allegations that he had been conducting unauthorized research on students without proper oversight or informed consent procedures. The investigation revealed that Webb's highway experiments were part of a larger research project focused on what he called environmental hypnosis, the use of monotonous or repetitive environmental conditions to induce altered states of consciousness that could be exploited for psychological manipulation and behavioral control. His academic papers, published in obscure journals, had attracted attention from researchers interested in crowd control and interrogation techniques. He was treating the entire Interstate 40 corridor as his laboratory, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who was brought in to assess Webb's methods and their potential applications. Webb understood that highway driving already induces a form of hypnotic state in many people, and he was using that natural phenomenon as a foundation for more intensive psychological manipulation that could compromise his subject's judgment and resistance to suggestion. When federal agents executed a search warrant at Webb's residence in Amarillo, they discovered extensive documentation of his highway experiments, including video recordings of his interactions with dozens of victims over the past year and a half. The recordings showed Webb using progressively more sophisticated techniques to induce hypnotic states in his subjects, while conducting what he claimed were traffic safety interviews designed to understand driver psychology and behavior. The SACE video evidence revealed the true scope of Webb's operation and the systematic nature of his exploitation of highway travelers. His recordings showed him approaching victims who had pulled over to help what they thought was a stranded motorist, then gradually shifting the conversation to psychological topics while using hypnotic techniques to alter their mental state and make them more susceptible to suggestion and control. The most disturbing discovery was Webb's collection of personal information about his victims, including home addresses, work schedules, family information, and detailed psychological profiles that he had compiled during his roadside encounters. He had been using the trust established during his initial highway encounters to gather intelligence that would allow him to contact victims later for what he called follow-up studies that involved more intensive psychological manipulation. Several women came forward after Webb's arrest to report that they had been contacted by him weeks or months after their initial highway encounters, sometimes at their homes or workplaces. Webb had used the personal information gathered during his roadside experiments to track down victims and subject them to additional psychological manipulation, often convincing them to participate in what he described as important research that would contribute to highway safety and driver education. He turned me into a research subject without my knowledge or consent, testified Sarah Martinez, one of Webb's victims, during his trial. I thought I was helping with legitimate highway safety research when he stopped me on Interstate 40. But he was actually testing how effectively he could control my thoughts and behavior. He used what he learned about me during that roadside encounter to manipulate me for months afterward, convincing me to participate in increasingly invasive psychological experiments. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Webb viewed his victims not as human beings deserving of respect and protection, but as experimental subjects whose experiences provided data for his research into psychological control techniques. His academic background had provided him with sophisticated knowledge of hypnosis and persuasion, while his position as a supposed researcher had given him credibility that victims found difficult to question. Webb's methods had evolved over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated as he refined his techniques based on the responses of previous victims. His highway experiments had served as a testing ground for psychological manipulation methods that he had planned to publish in academic journals, treating human suffering as raw material for advancing his career and reputation in the field of behavioral psychology. The trial became a landmark case in the intersection of psychology and criminal law, as prosecutors had to prove that Webb's use of hypnotic techniques constituted assault and fraud rather than legitimate research conducted within acceptable academic parameters. Expert witnesses testified about the ethical violations involved in conducting psychological experiments without informed consent and the potential for lasting harm from unauthorized hypnotic manipulation. Dr. Webb was ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges including fraud, assault, kidnapping conspiracy based on his use of psychological coercion, and violation of research ethics standards. His conviction resulted in a 15-year sentence and the permanent revocation of all professional licenses and certifications, effectively ending his career in psychology and research. For Trooper Morris, who had been Webb's final victim before his arrest, the case fundamentally changed her approach to traffic enforcement and her understanding of how sophisticated criminals could exploit the authority and trust associated with professional credentials. She became an advocate for training programs that taught law enforcement officers to recognize psychological manipulation techniques and resist attempts to compromise their judgment during routine encounters. Webb used my training against me. Morris explained during a conference presentation about the case that was attended by law enforcement officers from across the region. He understood that police officers are taught to be alert for obvious signs of impairment or deception, but we're not necessarily prepared for someone who uses subtle psychological techniques to compromise our judgment during routine encounters with apparently legitimate citizens. The case prompted the development of new training programs for law enforcement officers, focusing on recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation techniques that might be used by sophisticated criminals who understood how to exploit the authority and credibility associated with professional positions. The programs emphasize the importance of maintaining professional skepticism, even when dealing with individuals who presented themselves as researchers, academics, or other authority figures. Interstate 40 through the Texas Panhandle continues to carry heavy transcontinental traffic, but the memory of the highway hypnotist has changed how both law enforcement and travelers approach interactions with strangers on remote highways. New protocols encourage verification of credentials and careful documentation of any research-related contacts with unknown individuals claiming academic affiliations or conducting highway safety studies. The case also led to enhanced oversight of psychology research conducted in public settings, with new requirements for institutional review and approval of any studies involving interaction with members of the public without their explicit informed consent. Professional organizations strengthened ethical guidelines and reporting requirements to prevent abuse of academic credentials for criminal purposes. Today, the rest area near Groom, where Webb conducted his final experiment, serves as a reminder of how professional credentials and academic authority can be weaponized by those willing to exploit public trust for criminal purposes. Enhanced lighting and security cameras were installed at the facility, along with information encouraging travelers to report suspicious research activities or unusual encounters with strangers claiming academic affiliations. The highway hypnotist case remains a cautionary tale about the sophisticated methods that modern predators can use to exploit both human psychology and the isolation of America's highway system. For law enforcement officers and travelers alike, the case serves as a reminder that vigilance and skepticism are essential when dealing with unexpected encounters on remote highways, regardless of how professional or legitimate they might initially appear. Dr. Marcus Webb's abuse of academic credentials and psychological expertise represents a particularly insidious form of predatory behavior that exploited both professional trust and the natural vulnerabilities created by long distances. Highway travel. His conviction helped establish legal precedents for prosecuting crimes that involve sophisticated psychological manipulation. While his methods continue to influence training programs designed to help both law enforcement and civilians recognize and resist similar techniques, the victims of Webb's highway experiments gradually recovered from their experiences, but many reported lasting effects from the unauthorized psychological manipulation they had endured. Support groups were established to help victims understand what had been done to them and develop strategies for avoiding similar victimization in the future, while legal settlements provided compensation for the psychological trauma they had suffered. For the Texas Department of Public Safety, the highway hypnotist case highlighted the need for enhanced awareness of unconventional criminal methods and the importance of trusting officer instincts even when dealing with apparently legitimate authority figures. The case became a standard training example used to illustrate how criminals could exploit both professional credentials and environmental factors to commit sophisticated fraud and assault. The endless straight roads of the Texas Panhandle continue to induce the natural highway hypnosis that Webb exploited for his criminal experiments, but enhanced awareness and training help ensure that such manipulation is more likely to be recognized and reported before it can cause lasting harm. The case serves as a permanent reminder that predators can adapt any environment or situation to serve their purposes, and that constant vigilance is the price of safety on America's highways. The research that Webb claimed to be conducting was eventually completed by legitimate academic institutions under proper ethical oversight, providing valuable insights into highway safety and driver psychology without exploiting unwitting subjects. The contrast between legitimate research methods and Webb's criminal exploitation highlighted the importance of institutional oversight and ethical standards in protecting vulnerable populations from abuse by those in positions of authority and trust.